just wanted to say good evening and welcome. Bunjil Place proudly acknowledges the traditional owners of this land, Casey's Aboriginal communities and their rich cultures. And we pay respect to elders past, present and future. We acknowledge that Aboriginal people as Australia's first peoples and traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we work, live and make art. My name's Angela Barnett. I'm the Outdoor Screen Coordinator here at Bunjil Place, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first May edition of Art Bites with Atong Atem. Before I hand over to Atong, there are just a few housekeeping notes. Please help yourself to food and beverage throughout the night. There'll be someone now and also after the talk as well. We're also filming tonight's discussion, so so it will be uploaded to our website after the evening. And so tonight we're joined by Atong Atem, artist, photographer and filmmaker. Atong Atem's work explores the inherent intimacy of portraiture and photography, as well as the role photographers take in as storytellers. Atong interrogates photography as a framework for looking at the world and positioning people in it. She has exhibited extensively across Australia, including the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra, the National Gallery of Victoria, Monash University Museum of Art, Gertrude Contemporary, the Australia Centre of Contemporary Art, and recently she's curated shows for Photo 22 International Festival of Photography. She's also exhibited internationally at the Red Hooks Lab in New York, Messens in London, Vogue Fashion Fair in Milan, and Unseen Amsterdam Art Fair. So please give me a warm welcome to Atong Atem.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. It's an honour always to be in a position to be able to talk about your work as an artist, even if you feel like, oh, what is there to talk about? So the more that I've thought about this talk and in the lead up to it, the more I've come to the conclusion that there's actually too much to talk about. And I've tried to narrow it all down for you tonight. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're on. I grew up on the central coast of New South Wales, which is the lands of the Ku-ring-gai people, and have lived in Sydney and in Melbourne and a lot of different places in Australia. So a lot of my work often is about place, and it is very important and imperative to acknowledge place as a place that has been colonised and it's a place that belongs to Aboriginal people. And as a migrant, that's really relevant, and I think it's relevant to all of us. So I'm going to start by talking primarily about my influences and the reasons that I work with photography and filmmaking. And then I'll sort of show you a little snippet of the most recent film that I've made, Banksia, at the end. And I'll sort of talk a little bit about some of the things that I've made and why I've made them, with the framework being photography, since I predominantly do photography, and since we're in the middle of the International Photography Festival, which I hope you've all had a chance to look at work from. So I'm going to use the clicker because it works. So this is something that I tend to begin most of my talks with, which is an excerpt from a book called Physique and Stature from 1908, which is an interrogation of image making and specifically colonial depictions of African and colonised peoples, specifically from the lens of anthropology and, in this instance, ethnographic photography. And for the sake of those that will be watching this later, I will read this out. When colonial officials, settlers or outsiders took photographs of the colonised, this constituted ethnography. While white people took pictures of themselves, this constituted something different. It was personal, biographical or autobiographical, but not ethnographic. In such ethnographic photography, Africans are given culture but not history. That is why, conventionally, the presence of white people is elided from such photographs. What Penny describes as the effacement of any marks of the presence of the photographer's culture, That's from the colonizing camera, sorry. Photographs in the making of Namibian history, which I think is a relevant statement, and it's a relevant perspective for me as a photographer and for anyone, I think, that engages with photography. So my interest in photography and my work as an artist stemmed from studying at art school. I studied painting at Sydney University for a few years, and then I went on to RMIT for a little while. But throughout my art history and my art education, there was a lot of attempts, I suppose, to try to find myself in art history or find relevance to my own culture and my own history as a South Sudanese person, as a migrant, as an African woman, all of these intersections of identity. And it wasn't so much that I wanted to be replicated in the art that I was studying, but I wanted to feel like I wasn't explicitly uninvited or unwelcome in art spaces, especially when the depictions of people, and I've always been interested in portraiture, so I've always been interested in depictions of people. So especially when depictions of the people that I was looking at in art went out of their way to exclude people like me, or in this case of like odalisque paintings and orientalist paintings depicted dark-skinned and black people as servants or servers, or physically in painting history, often physically in the shadows. So I remember being like 20-something and thinking like Google is the answer to everything. If I just Google the right words, I will find what I'm looking for. And so I Googled some things, and then I realized that what I really, really wanted to find wasn't just paintings, because I had a very specific interest in photography. So I remember specifically typing into Google like black people photography history. And then I learnt about like ethnography as like the initial depictions of black people. So I have done you the service of Googling for you to show you what will come up. So if you type in ethnography or ethnographic photography Africa, which is, I wanted to see essentially my culture. I wanted to see pictures of people like me. I wanted to learn my culture, which is predominantly an oral history, and the majority of people who've documented my culture and my history are British and other European people who colonized parts of Africa, including South Sudan. And the images were purely ethnographic, even when I didn't want them to be, even when I didn't type in ethnographic. So as you can see in some of these pictures from the Google screenshot, it is pictures of people that position them within the realm of study. So within the realm of the way that you might photograph, say, plants, like botany and all that sort of stuff. And I think that that's very important in terms of our understanding of the lineage of photography to now. So that's my introduction. Me, I'm 21, I'm at uni, I want to see pictures of people that look like me so I can then photograph in a similar style, because I'm interested in history and I want to be part of it as an artist. And I'm confronted with these deeply confronting pictures. I don't know what I thought I'd find, but that's what I found. So then, thank you, internet, and thank you, art historians. With further research, I realized that I was not the only person in the world to be confronted by ethnographic depictions of African people, and there were, in fact, artists, thinkers, writers, musicians, photographers way before me who have also acknowledged that, yeah, colonialism was terrible and has done irreparable damage, and colonial depictions of people are terrible and have done irreparable damage. How do we talk about that? How do we work against that? So one of the first artists whose work showed me the light, so to speak, was Malik Sidibe, who was a Malian photographer, and his work has been shown everywhere. Like, name a place and they've either shown his work or sold a book of his works or something. And his work is really important for me because it represented that thing that I was interested in, which is how did we get to where we are now? Why am I in the 21st century not learning about this? And yet, you know, these depictions and these images exist. And why is it that when I search for photographs of African people from a certain point in time, it's showing me ethnographic images? So what Malik Sidibe was interested in, and a lot of predominantly West African photographers at the turn of the century, was in acknowledging the way that the camera is a tool inherently. It's a tool, it's a technological device that is a tool that has been weaponized. And they looked at photography as another, or the camera specifically, as another arm of all power structures. You know, when people take over, when people colonize, they don't do it in one specific way. There are multiple ways that they can do it. And so they saw the inherent power of photography to define cultures, to define individuals, and to define peoples at large. And so my specific interest in Malik Sidibe and other studio photographers from that time was in their ability to, one, recognise the power of the camera, and two, do something about it. And it was quite a simple thing that they did, but extremely powerful because it hadn't been done before, which was using that tool and using that camera and weaponising it, I suppose, for good, and using it as a tool to depict themselves and their own communities for and by themselves. And it's interesting that still to this day that's within photography and outside of photography, it's still like quite a struggle for people to use tools that have been used to oppress them and to weaponize them for the good of their own communities. Or maybe let's not even use the word weaponize because it's so loaded, to just use them to depict themselves the way that they want to be depicted. It's, to me, quite intriguing and quite upsetting as well that there are still communities that don't have their own voices afforded to them. So when Malik Sidibe and other Malian and West African photographers did what they're doing, they completely switched the narrative of what it means to depict and present African peoples, and the fact that African peoples can depict and present themselves. And the thing I like about his photography is that it's so inherently intimate. So there's not that much of a difference in terms of the comparison between his photography and the photography of the ethnographers, the predominantly European ethnographers. They're still black and white images taken with probably the same cameras, depicting individuals, sometimes in group settings, sometimes in costume or outfits that are like specifically put on for the occasion. But there's something about the gaze, and there's something about, I suppose, at the end of the day, the camera and the photography and the act of photographing is a power play. And there's like an ethic there. And what we're seeing, I suppose, that makes these different to ethnographic photographs is that the power imbalance is completely different. There is still a power imbalance. There is still power as a photographer, even if you're friends with the person you're photographing, but there's a huge difference between consenting to be photographed in a particular way, having the permission to present yourself the way that you wish to be presented in a photograph, and being presented as an object, being objectified in the way that ethnographic photography objectifies people. So that's Malik Sidibe, who I love. Another photographer whose work has really inspired my work is Kwame, Apagya, and still to this day, even though I don't use Facebook, he is my Facebook friend, and I say that at every talk because I'm proud of it. So his work, for me, kind of bridged the gap between the history of, we've got colonization, we've then got ethnographic photography, we've then got the studio photographs of West Africa, and then we've got, fast forward many decades, the family photos that I grew up with. And a lot of those family photographs are somewhere in the middle of what Kwame Apagya does and what some of those studio photographers do. What I really like about it is that it's depicting the artifice of studio photography. It's a performance. The whole thing is a performance. You set up lights, you set up a camera in a specific way, you bring people into a space, you tell them to pose in a certain way, you delete the photographs that aren't quite right, but it still feels like documentation. And that's something that I'm really, really interested in, that space between creating an artwork that is, guided and led and informed by the artist, the photographer, and also allowing space for the subject to become a subject rather than an object. And I find that really, really fascinating. I also really love that he's making a commentary on, I suppose, like Western standards of I don't know, what we should achieve or what we should aim for. The picture on the top right-hand corner is called the White House, and I just love everything about that, as well as the one, the bottom right-hand corner, which is a woman getting onto, it looks like an Air Ethiopia airplane, and it's like a little private jet moment. So it's these people that are making fun of the idea of success within Western standards of success and within this idealized version of life. So we're in the photo studio. What's our best self? What's our idealized version of ourselves? We're going to put on a cool outfit and we're going to sit in front of the White House lawn, which is something that even without the backdrop and even without the artifice, the act of taking a photograph still is doing that. You're still presenting your best self and you're still kind of performing an idealized version of yourself. Otherwise, we wouldn't delete the photos we didn't like. So this is my work that I did between 2014 and 2017. I made a series of works where I went to the Smithsonian archive online and I downloaded as many photographs that were ethnographic photographs of East Africa specifically, and then I later went to South Africa, West Africa. So that image on the left with the two men dancing is taken in Soweto in South Africa. The one on the right is a family in Egypt. And there was something that felt relevant to me about the act of, I suppose, reclaiming images that have sort of existed in a really terrible kind of dehumanizing way by making them my own. So I spent some time painting over them and did a series of hand-coloured works as my little kind of like, I want to say something about this history, I want to be part of it, I want to acknowledge that I'm the result of this history and I'm trying to talk about it. So these are some hand paint. This is a photo of women celebrating in South Sudan, before it was called South Sudan. I think this one's from either the 20s or 30s. And then the left two are Madagascar, and the one on the right is Nigeria. So I did a series of these images, and for me it was simply an act of reclaiming and acknowledging and having less fear about the ethnographic photographs, because there was an intense hurt, I think, about them, and an intense pain associated with the people that were being depicted and that lack of agency. And in my way, I'm still sort of like, I didn't ask them for permission, so I'm contributing to that in some way, but I wanted to create a tenderness and to create works that represented like my connection to that lineage and that history, whilst also creating beautiful artworks. And to me, that sort of started my interest in photography as an ethical dilemma, and being a photographer as an ethical question. I suppose I still think about that a lot, and it's something that I think is really important to think about as a photographer, professional or not professional, that there's so much power in depicting and capturing a moment, especially when it includes other people, and what happens in that dialogue and what doesn't happen in that dialogue is something that I think about a lot. So then we fast forward a little bit to the studio series that I did, which was my version of extending that practice of studio photography that happened as a response to ethnographic photography. So I asked a bunch of my mates to come to the drawing studio at RMIT University. When the security guard came in, I was like, oh yes, I work here and I'm doing a late night class. And he was like, it's like 8 p.m, what are you doing? And I told my friends, like, I'll get us all some food, just come, it'll be great. And they're like, cool, cool, cool. And then I locked myself out while my friends were inside, didn't bring any food, didn't have any money, and they ended up bringing food. So I'm forever grateful for friends. But for me, this was literally just about acknowledging a pre-existing history of image making that I thought was extremely important, that I thought was really relevant. And more than anything, I wanted to position myself in this art history rather than the art history that put people that looked like me physically in the shadows. And it was about I suppose I spent a lot of time feeling like I had to twist and change the European art history to fit within what I wanted and what I came from. And in doing so, I completely neglected the existence of this other art history, which is just art history, full stop, but that already made space for what I wanted to talk about and made space for people that looked like me. So making the studio series was a huge turning point for me, because it really just represents me picking up books and learning rather than making assumptions based on what I was exposed to. Here's some more work from the studio series. So I was really interested in recreating a lot of the imagery and a lot of the, I guess, visual language associated with the family photographs that I grew up with, which we will also circle back to towards the end of this. And it was really easy for me to make these works with these people who were my friends, because they also had that understanding, they had that same reference point. So when I said, hey, we're all gonna hang out and recreate some of the family photos that we grew up with, it was like, absolutely know what you're talking about. A lot of the props, a lot of the flowers, the costumes, the jewelry were mine, but even more of them were brought in by my friends. And I think that's a testament to, in a lot of ways, when I talk about the non-European art history, I think a lot of that also means an art history that is lived rather than, written down or practiced within universities, although that's really important. There's also an art history that exists in people's lives and in people's everyday lives. So when I go to my mum's house and I, talk about these studio photos that I want to reference, she's experienced them, she lived those things, but she doesn't necessarily think this is art history. She thinks I'm just taking photos, or she thinks I'm catching up with people that I haven't seen in a long time and documenting this moment in time, or we're documenting a wedding or whatever. So I found it really relevant as well to celebrate the almost mundane nature of some of our artistic practices, and rather than trying to institutionalize those practices, I wanted to just celebrate them and acknowledge their relevance, and also make space for people to continue doing them as much as they can. Another artist who I'm really inspired by is Kashonibari. So the reason I put him here after the studio photography is that he did something that I really love that he still does, which is using wax print fabrics to talk about colonialism in a way that's very beautiful, but also a little bit off-putting. What I saw, actually, before I go into it, I saw some of his work for the first time at the MCA, I think 2000 and something, maybe 10 years ago, if not more. Had no idea who he was, had no idea that people were using wax print fabrics for anything other than clothes that they wore to church, and had no idea that there was a history about them that was beyond what I already knew. So when I growing up, I was exposed to wax print fabrics as African materials. We called them African materials, we still call them African fabric, African material, African this, that, and the other. And there was an understanding that this stuff was inherently African and inherently of our culture. And then Kashonibari, made these works, put them in the MCA. I went to see them, read a little bit about him because I thought he was so amazing, and discovered that they were in fact Dutch. And I was like, okay, I've never seen a Dutch person wear them, so what are you talking about? So the history of these fabrics is that when the Dutch colonized Indonesia and then later parts of Africa, they were like, hey, we can make heaps of money if we sell these Indonesian batik fabrics to these people who love to wear lots of colour in parts of Africa that we've colonized, but we'll just alter them a little bit. And it worked, and then years later we think that they're our own, which is an interesting thing because I do think that they are our own, and I think it's testament to the fact that culture evolves over time. People change their relationship to objects in the same way that African photographers changed their relationship to ethnographic photography and the camera. We did the same thing. Yes, I'm claiming it. We did the same thing with Dutch wax print fabrics and completely changed the narrative about, I suppose, what Africanness means and looks like, which is another sort of point of my artistic practice, because I sort of initially wanted to make work that was African, quote unquote, and I spent a lot of energy and a lot of emotional resources trying to figure out what that was and how I could do that as an artist. And the more research I've done into the African art that I do like, the more I've kind of accepted and acknowledged that I'm trying to make Africa and Africanness, and to be more specific, South Sudan and Sudanese-ness, a small, finite thing by defining what is and is not that. And I'm not allowing space for culture to do what it does, which is grow, change, and evolve over time, like a living, breathing thing. So yeah, I think that the wax print conversation is a really interesting one in regards to the way that the tools of colonization have been used by the colonized people to re-empower us and to create our own moving, growing, evolving cultural practices, which I think is really amazing. One last artist I'll talk about is Wangechi Mutu, who is a Kenyan artist who lives in New York. And I'll also read this just for the benefit of those who are watching. I was witnessing how the body is politicized in art. I was always interested in the power of the body, both as an image and as an actual mechanism through which we exist and find out who we are. I was interested in what goes on inside, but also what people see you as. I was also looking at the history of the body, questioning issues of representation and perception. The body became the mechanism with which I was able to move my mind around all of these issues of otherness, of transplantedness as a young woman, my blackness as an African-raised black woman in New York City. So Wangechi Mutu is another artist whose work I think is amazing. That's a running theme on this. And her work is really relevant, again, as I guess a version of that reclamation. Her work is predominantly, or these works, she's done a lot of stuff since then, including sculpture, among other things. But these particular works, which I hope I've got another example, yes. These works are mostly collage, and so she was really interested in the same things that I started being interested at when I was young, which was that idea of representation and depiction more so than anything else. How am I depicted? How are my peoples depicted? And she went into the avenue of predominantly magazines and fashion and media culture in terms of depictions of black women, as well as just imagery in general. So a lot of her works are collages made out of fashion and porn magazines and all kinds of kind of general media representations, and she uses them to create these new beings that are representations of herself, and they're all kind of self-portraits in a way. But I thought it was a really, really fascinating way to talk about historical depictions and the way that we can use those to create new things, and the ways that we can use those histories to create new things in a quite a literal way that she's done. Again, another artist whose work I first saw at the MCA, so the moral of the story is go to the MCA if you can. Her work is incredible, and I implore everybody to find out more about her. So the last kind of thing I'll touch on is this thing that is actually new to me, but not new at all, which is the crystalist movement, which happened in Sudan in the 70s. So it's always been a point of interest to me that the difference between Sudan and South Sudan, which not everybody is aware of. I'm South Sudanese. People who look like me are mostly South Sudanese. South Sudan was pre-British colonialism colonized by Arab Muslims from the north, and there's a huge history and like kind of conflict between the two, and South Sudan became its own country in 2011, so it's a very new country, and there's a lot of intense politics in the differences between Sudan and South Sudan. But regardless of that, I always found it really difficult to come across art from either Sudans as a point of, I suppose I wanted to orient myself within where I'm from, what happened there before I was born, and how can I kind of reference that in my work as a migrant who is still so grounded and rooted in the place that I come from. So I came across the Crystalists, who are a group of artists in Sudan, North Sudan. Some were South Sudanese, the majority were North Sudanese, and they made lots of different art, predominantly painting and sculpture, and they started a movement called the Crystalists, which was about creating a new way of thinking about art. They wrote a manifesto, which is really beautiful and has been translated into English, and their whole thing was to talk about art from a new perspective and from an intrinsically Sudanese perspective with reference to Sudan as a place that was colonized. And I'll just read a little excerpt from it, which is on beauty, which I think is beautiful. No one laughed. I thought it was funny. In response to the question of what beauty is, we say that the crystal represents utmost beauty, and that the most prominent quality of the crystal is its liberality, in the sense of its being liberated. Furthermore, we maintain that a thing becomes beautiful when it has acquired a certain measure of dissolving objective limitations, which again, I think is very beautiful, but I think is also a really relevant continuation of that thread of things are presented in a particular way. We are told who we are given status and identity from those who have more power than us, and then over time we redefine language, we redefine beauty, we redefine all the things that have been used to either include or exclude us, and we create something new from it, which is what the Crystalists did. And one of the most prominent artists within the Crystalist Manifesto, whose work is visible here, is Kamala Ibrahim Ishag, who made a lot of works of women in crystals. So the whole point of the crystal as a symbol, I suppose, within the Crystalist Manifesto is that it represents infinity, and it represents infinite possibilities, but it also is a singular thing. And they were really interested in the artist and the individual being that, like infinite but also singular. And there's a lot of sort of Sufism involved in their way of thinking. It's very philosophical. It's a little bit woo-woo, but I love woo-woo. And it's also just like quite grounded. They're also really interested in like quantum physics and quantum science and the idea of like cellular infinity, and the idea of like, you know, a small kind of 1 millimeter circle on your palm is made up of millions, if not billions, of other parts. And there's something really interesting in that from my perspective as a migrant person who's constantly interested in identity, and being able to kind of give myself permission to be as infinite as the, you know, infinite refractions of a crystal, whilst also being this like solid individual personal person. But also their works are very, very beautiful. I think they're really incredible. And these are also interestingly quite recent paintings that Kamala did. The next image is a photo of her in front of one of her paintings. I saw on Sotheby's today when I was looking for like one particular image that I didn't end up finding, that her work sell for like £80,000. So she's not like an unknown artist. She's very, very established. And she would be, I think, she was 80 in 2019, so she's about 83, 84 now, and still making extremely beautiful work, which is really profound. I think as someone who spent so much time trying to find an art history that represented where I'm coming from and where I physically come from, it's a huge deal to be able to find that, you know, I just wasn't doing my research, and now that I'm doing my research, it's like she's the tip of the iceberg. So these are some family photos that are included in my new book, Surat, which is in the photo edition series. It's the second one, and it's coming out very, very shortly. But the reason that I included these in there is to show that reference point of the imagery that I grew up with that inspired my relationship to photography as this like photographic artistic practice. Yes, that little baby is me. Yeah, adorable, I know, right? And there's photos of my aunties, my grandmother, my older sister, and the one that I like the most, interestingly, is the one that's just the text on the back of the photo that my mum wrote, and it says, Addis Ababa, something, April 1991, Atong 5 days old, and that's what's on the back of that photo of my mum's friend holding me as a child. There's just something about these objects that I grew up with that have really informed my relationship to photography's documentation as a thing that can be tender and beautiful, but also as just like an everyday practice, which is what I try to do. And then these are the images that are in Surat. So that book I recreated family photos, but also kind of took them to this surrealist, maybe crystalist kind of position. I thought it was really important for me to lean into the fact that I don't know a lot and to fill in the gaps with my own imagination, and I think that that's kind of what history is anyway. But as an artist, it felt like that's my cultural stamp on this tradition that I'm following. Some more photos, me pretending to be multiple people. And then the last thing that I'll show you, hopefully there's not time running out, is a couple of stills from the film that I made that I mentioned, Banksia, which is also about migration and all of that. And I don't know how the audio will work on this, but we will try. I'm going to show a little video cannot be loaded, just kidding. So I'll talk about Banksia a little bit, and maybe we can see the video another time. But that was a film that I made in 2020 for Rising Festival. No one got to see it, but you will get to see it this year at this year's Rising Festival, Golden Square Car Park. Be there, it's totally free. For me, Banksia was sort of the pinnacle, the penultimate kind of representation or presentation of all of these things that I've shown you all tonight, which is my interests in history and documentation and personal narratives, and being able to bring them all together and have this sort of multifaceted perspective of living in the world as an individual person and presenting it in one neat package. I think that there's like a lot of profound possibilities in art making, and profound doesn't have to be world shaking in a big way. Profound can be just intimate and beautiful, which is what I try to do, and that's what Banksia is. So like, please go see it, and maybe I'll open up the floor to some questions. Yes, anonymous person over there that's not my friend Vinaya.
As we are in Bunjil Place, and I've been looking at the wonderful video works behind you, and I wondered if you could please talk a bit more about those works that we are seeing today.
Amazing. Great question, Vinaya, I assume is your name. So the works behind me, there's I think 3, maybe 4 different works that are cycling through. The one that is currently being shown is a 4-panel work that I actually made. I don't know if I've told people this, but it was the last thing I made at RMIT when I was studying there before I dropped out. And I made it for a uni assignment, but then I liked it so much that I ended up having it, like working on it a little bit more and presenting it at Signal in the city. They have a Signal Screens commission, which I was really lucky enough to be asked to make a work for. And because the Signal, the space, which is like an art space in the city near the water, it sort of has this LCD screen situation that wraps around the building. And so I wanted to make a work that wrapped around it. So imagine it wrapping around a building. And that work was about a lot of different things, but I suppose more importantly, I made it at a time when I was just really beginning to feel less shy about showcasing self-portraiture. Prior to then, I hadn't really made many self-portrait works. And because I was having these questions about, I suppose, the ethics of depicting other people, the ethics of photographing people, I wanted to sort of play around with those ethics as ethically as I could, which was by doing it with myself and photographing myself and, you know, asking those questions with and of myself. And interestingly, the conclusion that I arose at is that you can still other yourself, and you can still do wrong ethically by yourself, because we are all kind of informed by the world around us, which has very specific kind of hierarchies, and those hierarchies can be very easily reproduced in the work that we make, especially if it's of ourselves, and especially if it's portraiture, and especially if there's elements of, I suppose, performance and performativity in it. So it was really interesting to make that work, which showcased me in this sort of like alien beauty, intense kind of persona, but the text is all very kind of chaotic, sad girl text about, like, I suppose my own stuff, and I really liked the idea of juxtaposing the things that I'm asking behind the scenes of making the work that I make, while also presenting this like vibrant, from a distance, really kind of pretty and shallow maybe work. But I also liked the idea of having text at different sizes, so that, because it's, again, thinking of Signal as this sort of like beacon in the middle of the city, I liked the idea of people being able to see certain things from really far away, but having to get closer to see other things, which is, I guess, how people engage with art in a gallery space. So I wanted to recreate that in a non-gallery space and in like a public space, because I'm always thinking of, like, you know, as someone who did not have a lot of money growing up because I spent all of my money on vintage clothes, I could never afford to go to all the things that I wanted to see, especially art shows and stuff that I wanted to see. So public art for me is really profound, and I love to try to treat public art in the same way that, you know, you would treat like a gallery exhibition show. And then the other stuff is work that I made for, so that work, Blueface, I made that for Centre for Projection Art. And they have a festival of projection at Gertrude Street called the Gertrude Street Projection Festival. I got there eventually. So GSPF, I was very, very honoured to be asked to make a work that would go on the giant commission towers in the gardens on Gertrude Street. And again, that question of ethics, of like thinking about the people that live there, what am I going to do, how, like the optics, I suppose, of like putting something on people's homes was really fascinating to me. And so I thought it was really relevant to put myself there and to kind of, I don't know, make work that was really, really kind of not non-human, kind of a little bit parody, a little bit silly, but also really like intimate and personal. Like, it's my face really, really close up. You can see the pores really, really close up. And it felt like if I'm going to, you know, ask to be on people's homes, I need to sort of respond to that with my own vulnerability. And again, there was a vulnerability of self-portraiture and the vulnerability of performing in front of a camera in my bedroom and then putting it at like 17,000 times the scale of my real face on these giant buildings. And it was really well received, and I was really happy about that, but it was still very like, oh my God, it's a big face. And then the other work is another version that I made for the Projection Festival, but because it was other people, I chose not to put it on there and used other images instead. I'm constantly thinking about the ethics of photography in a way that it doesn't hold me back. I think a lot of people think that I'm saying, like, I can't do that because it's not ethical. It's like, I don't want to do that. Like, I think the more I think about what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, the more I realize what I do actually want to do. And that can be, like, the same applies to ethics as much as like color. What colors do I and do I not want to use? You know, what kind of scales, what kind of face paint or not. And I think a lot of really beautiful things come from questioning your own actions and your own inherent bias and your own sort of unassumed instinct. Like, where does that instinct actually come from? So that's kind of what I do a lot. Any other questions?
Just wondering, do you ever struggle with the question of identity as an immigrant? And how does that come through in your work? Absolutely. I think it's like one of the biggest themes in my work, I suppose, like identity, migration, blah, blah, blah. Especially from like a colonial perspective and being so blatantly aware of like my own displacement as a person
due to colonization, and then the results of colonization, and the fact that colonialism didn't just sort of disappear. And I don't know, without it sounding crass, I constantly think about like the fact that I'm here not by choice, like I didn't ask to be here. And there's a lot of sort of, I suppose, pressure from certain kind of spaces to be grateful that I'm, you know, better off and blah, blah, blah. But there's just so much complexity there, because arguably I'd be better off with my family and with a culture that I love and want to feel connected to. So it's really complicated, but it's also quite interesting for me as well, thinking about Australia as a presently colonised place and my relationship to that as a migrant as well. So I think recently I've been drawn to making work that's more about here, and that is accepting the fact that this is where I live and this is where I've grown up and this is the accent that I have. I'm making work that sort of places myself here within the framework of colonialism, but also within the framework of the colonialism that isn't from South Sudan, like the colonialism here. Yeah, there's a lot there, but there's also, I think, and this is what I tried to explore in Banksia, a lot of really interesting things that come out of people who've migrated. Like there's new cultures that come out of displacement, I suppose, and I'm really interested in that. So yeah, I don't know, I'm constantly uncertain of how to identify as a person in the world. Like I'm South Sudanese and I feel very South Sudanese, and that's where I'm from and that's the culture that I come from. But I was born in Ethiopia, and you know, I grew up here, and you know, I speak Dinka, but not as well as I would like to. And I think similar to what I was saying before about culture being very static, and that's an issue. The idea, like thinking of culture as a static thing, is an issue. The more I've let go of the idea of being South Sudanese as any one particular thing, the more space I've allowed for myself to just kind of be a person. Yeah, and it's also kind of like, just for me personally, I spent so much time being like, oh my God, who am I? That it was like, oh, this is actually really boring. Like, let's ask another question. So now the thing that I'm interested in is like, what do I actually want to do? Like, what do I like? What am I interested in outside of trying to prove anything to myself about who I am and who I can be? And I'm interested in like so much. And again, this is my interest in the Crystalists and their manifesto and movement. I love this idea of like, the true beauty of being a human and the true kind of power innate to all human people is being able to be 6 million things at once and still being a single object if you want to be. And I find that really, really beautiful and actually extremely liberating. So I don't know if I answered your question, other than yes, I do think about identity a lot. Yeah, thank you. Another question in the back.
Hi, Atong. Thank you for the wonderful talk and the great work you do. I've been following your work for a long time, actually. It's the first time I've got to ask you a question. But it's not so much about the works you've done, but maybe I did not know about certain things. So I always wondered about asking a little bit outside. A few years ago in Melbourne, there was a lot of talk about, politically motivated talk about people from South Sudan and young people from South Sudan, and how they've been perceived and all of that. And I understand it's a very politically motivated, you know, it's served a purpose. But as some of the few people who are more prominent of that culture, have you ever felt the pressure to make work to address that issue? Or is it by doing that we unnecessarily give more oxygen than it deserves? Or have you ever had any thought process on that? Maybe I did not see that work. If you did anything, would you like to talk about that, if that's okay with you?
Sure.
Thank you.
That's a really interesting question. I'm really glad you asked it, because I do get asked to talk about things of that nature quite a lot. And I think in the past I was really, I felt pressured to do that, and it's sort of like, you know, if you have a voice, use it, is sort of the thing that a lot of us grew up hearing. But I think, realistically, not everyone who is loud should be talking. And when it comes to that particular issue, which is more about, I suppose, politicians scapegoating a group of people, which is about the media choosing specific narratives that will create engaging content more than it is about actual truth. And, you know, we can all sort of do that research, and I don't have the numbers on hand, but you know, we're all aware of the way that sort of played out. And I think for me, I made my worst work in terms of how I felt about the work, but also in terms of how I think it looked, and in terms of how I felt after making the work when I was trying to do something, and when I was trying to speak about something. And like, I don't think that's my particular job as an artist, because at the end of the day, those narratives weren't about any reality, any truth. It wasn't, I suppose, if I was to do anything to change the political and media narrative around South Sudanese people, specifically in Melbourne, telling the truth wouldn't be enough, because it was never truthful to begin with, and it was all kind of like, they knew that they were lying, they knew that they were making up narratives. And again, it led to this, it kind of leads to, not for everybody, but I feel like it leads to the potential of this sort of like, model migrant, and having to be a really perfect version of a particular group of people in order to make people feel unjustified in their grossness. And I don't want to perpetuate that narrative. I don't want people to feel like that we're only valid as people, as South Sudanese people, if we're perfect, and that we're only valid and worthy of respect and humane treatment if we're doing better than average. And I grew up with that as well, because I grew up in a semi-rural part of New South Wales where there was no other South Sudanese people until my cousins moved to near us, and there weren't many African people, there weren't many people of colour, and there were a lot of narratives around migrants sort of, taking, and migrants having to owe the rest of Australia this, that or the other. And I felt really pressured, because I felt like the only way out of subjugation was to be better and better and better. And I got like real good grades, and I got into the university that I wanted to study architecture, and like nothing changed. It's sort of like that story of Oprah, who is, her own problematic person, but Oprah, one of the world's most well-known black women with lots and lots of money, she was in Paris at some handbag store and got accused of stealing. So I feel like, the problem isn't the individuals who are being, persecuted against. I think the problems exist within the system, and I think it's the responsibility and the duty of those who have power within the systems to acknowledge that they are intentionally doing the bad things. And my job as an artist, I think, is to be as true and as honest to myself and my perspective as possible. And if there's any kind of good, social good that comes out of that social good for maybe my people, for South Sudanese people, is like, look, you don't have to be a lawyer, doctor, blah, blah, blah. You can make art, you can be honest, you can represent your culture in your own way, and that's great. And I think having recent recognition and a lot of really amazing prizes and awards and blah, 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 and being earnest and honest and sentimental and gentle and all of that stuff is testament to the potential for honesty and individuality or whatever to lead to good places. But to sort of sum it up, I'm not a politician, I'd do a shit job at that. I'm not a journalist, I'd do a shit job at that. And I think it's the responsibility of the people who would do a good job of that to do that job. Artists just want to make art. Is there any other questions? But thank you, that was actually a very good question.
No, well, I think we'll wrap it up there, and thank you so much, Atong, for giving such a really amazing insight into your work, into your practice, and the beautiful work that you create. And so everybody, please please.
Thank you.
Join with me to thank Atong. Thank you.
Thank you so much.